By the time Arthur started screaming for me to stop, the quarry had already learned my voice. Every floodlight on the eastern rim burned white against the dust, flattening the world into bone and chalk. Below me, the deepest cut no longer looked like a pit. It looked like a pupil. The walls had gone glossy in places, not wet exactly, but alert, as if stone could turn its head without moving. I had both hands on the excavator horn, leaning my weight into it until my shoulders shook. The sound should have been crude and mechanical. Instead, it came back layered with other notes, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, as though the noise were being passed from one enormous throat to another, somewhere under the terraces. My radio crackled, not with static, with my own voice. "Arthur," it said, calm and close to my ear. "It knows which of us is leaving." Then the quarry answered through the metal grating under my boots. 3 slow knocks. A pause. 3 more. Not random, not seismic, patient. I felt them travel up my shins and settle behind my teeth like a second pulse. Arthur was still shouting from the tunnel mouth, but I could barely hear him now. The walls around the deepest cut were filling with human outlines, pressing outward from inside the stone, as if the quarry had finally decided to show me everyone it had kept. 48 hours earlier, I still believed the rules were meant to protect me. I took the Black Ridge job because no reputable company in 3 states would hire me for anything involving liability, paperwork, or a sworn statement. That was the official version anyway. The less official truth was that quarries and mine sites were the only places where my mind ever went quiet. I used to tell myself it was professional habit. I'd spent 11 years as an insurance investigator, crawling through collapsed warehouses, burned-out machine shops, flooded basements, and once, a strip mine where a pump house had blown its roof into the next county. You learned how to look at wreckage without getting romantic about it. You looked for sequence, negligence, and money. Then came the explosion in Pennsylvania. 7 men dead. 2 of them boys, really. A methane pocket, they said. A natural accumulation. Bad luck. Nobody could have seen it coming. That was what I signed my name to after the company lawyer took me out to dinner. After a man with clean cuffs and ruined eyes slid an envelope across the table and said, "This keeps everyone from losing more than they already have." I told myself I was sparing widows a trial. I told myself I was sparing the town another funeral procession. Mostly I was sparing the operator who had ignored 3 failed gas readings and the corporation that had kept him in place, because downtime cost more than dead men. The report stood. My name remained on it. Everything else in my life left. So when I saw the handwritten sign at Maddox Fuel and Feed in Rutland, overnight site watchman, temporary, Black Ridge Quarry, cash bonus for full month, I took down the number before I could invent reasons not to. The supervisor who met me at the gate introduced himself as Ken Barlow and shook my hand without really touching it. He was in his 50s, raw-boned, flannel over a thermal shirt, quarry dust still silvering the folds around his eyes. He gave me a flashlight, a radio, a key ring with too many keys, and a timesheet clipped to a hardboard clipboard. "Patrol the rim roads every hour," he said. "Check the equipment sheds, fuel lockup, and admin trailer. Log anything unusual. Unusual like theft?" He looked past me, toward the cut in the land. Sure, it was late October, and Vermont had already crossed that line where the air stopped smelling like leaves and started smelling like stone and water, and things sealed up for winter. Black Ridge lay beyond a screen of pines on land the sunset hit too early. It wasn't a picturesque old quarry with calm blue water and hiking trails. It was a wound. The granite shelves dropped in hard gray tears toward a darkness at the bottom that seemed to absorb the evening rather than wait for it. A huge excavator sat motionless on the quarry floor, its arm folded like a preying insect. Rust had found the joints, but not conquered them. There were floodlight poles along the upper terraces, camera housings on several corners, and a line of maintenance tunnels bored into the western side, like old animal dens. "You got an orientation binder?" I asked as Ken checked his watch for the third time. "Yeah, in the trailer." He was already backing toward his truck. "Nothing you need tonight, mostly old safety language." He climbed in, started the engine, then rolled the window down again. "If you hear blasting sirens, don't move until they stop." I laughed because I assumed he was joking. He didn't laugh back. "Anything else?" I said. He hesitated, looking genuinely torn between two bad options. Then he shook his head. "Lock the gate after me." His truck fishtailed gravel all the way to the road. For a few minutes after he left, the place felt almost reasonable. Remote, yes, neglected. A little theatrical in the way abandoned work sites could be after dark, where every tool left out started to look like evidence of interrupted thought, but still reasonable. I had worked lonelier jobs than that. I locked the gate, checked the admin trailer, and found old maps, stale coffee grounds, a humming mini-fridge with nothing in it, and no binder. I told myself Ken had forgotten it at home. The radio hissed once and settled. I walked the East Rim Road, my flashlight grazing reflective tape on fuel drums and cable spools. The quarry floor below seemed farther away than it should have been, the way some stairwells feel longer looking down than climbing up. I remember pausing beside the inactive excavator and thinking how strange it was that such a large machine had been left in place instead of stripped for parts. I climbed down the access road to take a better look. I shouldn't have bothered, but there are old instincts that survive disgrace. You see a machine, you check whether it really is dead. You make a note. You give somebody a line item to ignore later. The cab door stuck before giving way. Inside smelled of dust, hydraulic fluid, and old heat trapped in upholstery. The keys weren't in the ignition, but the battery still had enough life for a gauge cluster flicker when I turned the auxiliary switch. I remember grinning despite myself. It felt like catching a lie. Out of habit, or maybe because the silence down there seemed to be waiting for something to break it, I pressed the horn. It let out one long, ugly bellow that ricocheted off the quarry walls and vanished upward into the dark. Nothing else happened. No avalanche, no alarms, no unseen foreman on the radio cursing me out. Just the embarrassment of making noise in a place that hadn't asked for any. "Good work, Foster," I muttered, and climbed back out. It was only later, in the admin trailer, with the kettle whining on a hot plate and the first real cold pushing through the windows, that I found the rule sheet tucked under the clipboard on the desk. It was a single page, photocopied too many times, with no letterhead and no date. The text had been typed originally, but some lines had been crossed out and rewritten by hand in block capitals dark enough to dent the paper. Black Ridge, overnight procedures. Never use any machine horn after sunset. Never shine floodlights into the deepest cut after midnight. Ignore voices repeating your radio calls. If blasting sirens sound, remain exactly where you are until silence returns. Never count more than 5 terraces. If fresh footprints appear in solid stone, continue walking. If you see a person below the 5th terrace after 1:00 a.m., do not call out to them. Do not enter the west maintenance tunnels, unless instructed by Arthur. There were more on the reverse side. I stood there reading them with a paper cup cooling in my hand, feeling first amused, then irritated. Arthur, whoever he was, had a childish sense of humor, or the Quarry did. Remote work sites sometimes cultivated folklore the way offices cultivated passive aggression. Somebody always invented rituals to make boredom feel ceremonial. Then I saw Rule 1 again. Never use any machine horn after sunset. I looked toward the dark window over the sink, as if expecting somebody to be standing outside enjoying the joke. There was only my own reflection, and the blacker shape of the quarry beyond it. I turned the page over. On the back, in blue pen, someone had written a note in the margin. If Rule 1 is broken, log the time exactly, and do not return to the quarry floor before dawn. I checked my watch. 6:42 p.m. That was when I'd sounded the horn. I almost laughed. Instead, I wrote the time down because I had spent too many years dismissing odd details before they grew teeth. At 7:03, as I was finishing the first entry in the logbook, the radio at my hip cracked alive. "Unit 3, a man's voice said faintly. "Did you hear that?" I snatched it up. "Who is this?" No answer. Only a soft burst of static and something like breath being dragged slowly across gravel. I tried again. "Ken?" The radio stayed dead. I spent the next hour telling myself it was interference, old equipment, a crossed frequency from a hunting camp, maybe a road crew. I finished the patrol. I checked the locks twice. I made coffee I didn't drink. At 8:11, while standing on the north rim and looking down where the excavator had become a blacker shape in blackness, I heard the horn again. It came from below, not as loud as before, not immediate either. It arrived with the wrong shape to it, stretched and blunted, as if the quarry had stored the sound somewhere deep and was only now deciding to return it. I knew exactly what it was. I knew exactly when I had made it, and I knew, with a certainty that made the skin on the back of my neck go cold, that the echo had taken more than an hour to come back, because something below had listened to it first. If I had possessed a better instinct for self-preservation, I would have left before the end of that first night. I didn't leave, because men like me got good at mistaking stubbornness for courage. We also got good at dividing fear into categories we could manage: mechanical, environmental, human. The unknown had to pretend to be one of those eventually. That was the deal reality made with us. By dawn, the quarry had still not done anything I could put on paper without embarrassing myself. A delayed echo, a strange radio transmission, a sheet of rules somebody in a bad mood had typed up years ago. When Ken arrived to relieve me, I showed him the page and asked why he'd forgotten the orientation binder. He stared at the rules longer than necessary. "Where'd you find this?" "Desk drawer." He folded the paper once, very carefully, and gave it back to me. "Keep it on you." "That's your explanation?" "That is my advice." I told him I'd use the excavator horn before reading Rule 1. For a second I thought he might actually hit me. All the color went out of his face. "What time?" 6:42. He shut his eyes, as if running numbers in his head. And nothing, unless you count a delayed echo and a weird radio call. He muttered something I didn't catch. Then louder. "If it repeats tonight, log the time again. Don't answer anything that sounds like you." What is that supposed to mean? It means the radio carries. Carries what? But he was already walking away from me toward the trailer, as if proximity to the subject itself was unwise. I should have quit then. Instead, I bought groceries, slept 6 uneasy hours in the motel outside Pittsfield, and returned at dusk with the rules folded in my breast pocket like a warrant. The first week passed in a way that made me distrust my own memory of it. Nothing dramatic happened. Nothing happened that could be shown to another person and survive daylight. Yet the entire place acquired the slow wrongness of a sentence with a word missing. Every sound developed a delay. I would shut a gate and hear the metal impact 3 breaths later, from somewhere below me instead of behind. Gravel shifted under my boots, and then another set of steps, my steps, only not quite, would continue after I stopped. Once, while checking the fuel lockup, I heard my ring of keys jingle a full 5 seconds after my hand had gone still. On the 3rd night, I radioed the gate check to nobody in particular, following procedure. "North access secure," the speaker hissed. 10 seconds passed. Then my own voice came back, lower and slightly amused. "North access secure." Not a recording, not exactly. The pacing was wrong. The consonants were softened, as if spoken by someone whose mouth had learned my words by touching them from the inside. I told myself it was feedback. The quarry did not care what I told myself. By the 5th night, I understood that the rules had not been written to be obeyed, so much as navigated. Some of them triggered nothing. Some of them seemed to trigger the same thing with different timing. A few were impossible to follow literally. Never count more than 5 terraces sounded simple, until you looked down from the south rim and realized the cuts seemed to rearrange themselves in peripheral vision. You could pick out 1, 2, 3, 4 broad shelves, then another narrow ledge hidden in shadow, then one more beyond that might have been a trick of the moon. I caught myself counting and stopped at 5 with a childish flash of relief. That same night, around 1:15 a.m., I heard what I thought was Ken on the radio. "Eli, you on West Side?" I answered before remembering Rule 3. "Yeah, why?" Silence. Then, from somewhere far below the deepest cut, my own voice shouted back up at me, thinned by distance and stone. "Yeah, why?" I stood frozen in the road, flashlight trembling against my thigh. The reply had not come through the speaker. It had come through the quarry itself. I did not answer again. A storm moved through on the 7th night, low clouds scraping the rim, wind pressing cold mist into the cut. The place should have sounded alive with runoff and branches and loose gravel, but the storm only made the delays worse. Rain struck my hood, and the quarry repeated it later, in great soft sheets. Thunder rolled overhead, and then, after an impossible pause, rolled upward from underground. At 11:38, while I was sheltering under the lean-to beside the maintenance shed, the excavator horn returned. I knew it before it finished sounding. I knew the exact length of it, the little hitch at the end where I'd taken my hand off too fast. It was my horn. From the first night, coming back at me after nearly a week. It rose from the deepest part of the quarry, like a memory surfacing through black water. The note should have decayed. Instead, it prolonged itself. The farther it traveled, the stronger it became, until it sounded less like a machine and more like something huge imitating one. I ran to the rim despite the rain. Down below, the excavator sat where it always had, motionless, unlit. But around it, across the terraces and walls, the horn kept moving, bouncing, multiplying, each reflection arriving a fraction more precise than the last. I realized with a sickness that had nothing to do with fear that the quarry was not echoing the sound. It was refining it. The horn died all at once. In the silence that followed, my radio clicked. A woman's voice, very old or very weak, said, "It heard the introduction." "Who is this?" I asked, though I already knew better than to. No response. A second later, my own voice came from beneath my boots, faint but distinct. "Who is this?" The next morning I asked Ken who had access to the frequencies. "No one we use now," he said. "Now?" He wiped quarry dust from his palms onto his jeans and avoided my eyes. "Some old equipment still picks things up. Voices?" He gave me a look I understood too well from my investigator years. It was the look of a man deciding whether ignorance could still protect another man. "Eli," he said, "did you ever hear of Arthur Hale? Rule 8 mentions him." Ken nodded once. "If you have a problem you can't explain, and I mean really can't explain, you do not go into the west tunnels unless he tells you to. If he wants you, he'll find you." That should have sounded absurd. What it sounded like was local law. "And if I quit?" Ken's mouth tightened. "Then quit, before it learns your schedule." I laughed at that, because the alternative was to hear the sincerity in it. I stayed, because I needed the money. I stayed because I wanted to prove that whatever Black Ridge was doing to sound and distance and common sense, it still belonged to the world of causes. Most of all, I stayed because some ugly part of me had started to suspect that the quarry recognized me in a way no living person ever had. When I walked those roads at night, listening to my own footsteps arrive late from below, I had the constant impression that something was trying not to scare me. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. Predators hid from what they intended to eat. Only hosts learned your voice before inviting you in. The first rule I broke on purpose was the terrace rule. I did it out of spite. There is a stage in fear where the mind stops recoiling and starts testing the bars. The quarry had made me feel watched for 8 nights straight. Watched, not with hunger exactly, but with patience. I wanted something clear in return. Punishment if necessary. A result that belonged to action instead of insinuation. So on the 9th night I stood at the south overlook with my flashlight off and counted every visible level aloud. 1, I said, looking at the upper hall road. 2. My voice fell away into the cut and returned much later, not from the same direction. 3, 4, 5. The lower shelves grew harder to separate the longer I looked. One of them seemed to buckle inward into shadow. Another appeared beneath it, where there should have been none. I kept counting anyway. 6, 7. The instant the word left my mouth, something cracked on the far wall. I took a step back, convinced the whole terrace face was coming down. A spill of stone broke loose from high above and thundered toward the road where I stood. I had just enough time to cover my head with my arms. The slide split around me. That is the only honest way I can describe it. Boulders the size of coolers bounced off the grade, changed direction, and tore past on either side hard enough to cut my cheeks with grit. Smaller fragments skittered between my boots without striking them. In less than 4 seconds it was over. Dust drifted through my flashlight beam. The road behind me had been half buried. The ground where I stood was untouched. I didn't feel lucky. I felt selected. The second rule I broke was less deliberate. 2 nights later, the radio called my name from the west side. Not from the speaker, from down inside the quarry, where sound had no business organizing itself into language. Eli. I was crossing between the admin trailer and the fuel lockup. The voice was male, and familiar in a way I couldn't place. I ignored it and kept walking. A moment later it came again. Eli Foster. Nobody at Black Ridge used my last name. Even Ken avoided names when possible, as though too much specificity had value down there. I stopped. The quarry gave the delayed version of my own footsteps time to catch up. For 3 seconds, I stood in darkness surrounded by myself. Then the voice said, much more softly, "Report says natural causes." My chest went hollow. I took out the radio. "Who is this?" No answer. Instead, the handheld speaker emitted the scrape of paperwork being turned. I would swear to that under oath even now. Not a voice, not static. Paper. Heavy paper. The kind in old claim files. "Stop," I said. The radio crackled with my own voice replying from somewhere too near the deepest cut. "Stop." Then, in a voice that was no one I knew, and everyone I had tried not to remember, 7 knocks sounded from beneath the western wall. Not random, deliberate, evenly spaced. I should have retreated. Instead, I found myself following the sound down the service road with the stupid, fixed concentration of a man who believes if he can only identify the mechanism, shame itself might become solvable. That was the 3rd rule. If you see a person below the 5th terrace, after 1:00 a.m., do not call out to them. I hadn't thought of it until I saw the figure. He stood 2 levels below me near a line of broken core samples, wearing a hard hat and reflective vest gone gray with age. I could not see his face, only the slight lift of his shoulders, as if he were listening too. "Hey!" I shouted before sense caught up. "You can't be down there." He turned his head slowly. There was no face under the hard hat, not darkness. Stone, a smooth, pale oval with shallow grooves where features should have been, as if a sculptor had outlined a man and then forgotten the rest. I stumbled backward, lost my footing, and slid 3 yards down loose scree. The flashlight flew from my hand. I heard it crack once and go out. Above me, to the right, a chain of unstable rocks let go. I was still half sitting, half falling, when the first boulder should have crushed me. Instead, it slammed into the slope and lodged itself against another rock, creating a pocket just wide enough for my body. More debris poured around that new angle, diverting past my legs and into the lower road. By the time I stopped moving, I was pinned in a cradle of stone that had formed itself around me, without touching anything essential. The faceless worker was gone. I lay there gasping, my scalp crawling, and understood two things at once. First, the rules weren't superstition. Second, whatever enforced them was making exceptions for me. The maintenance crew stopped speaking freely around me after that. There were only 3 of them left doing daytime checks. Ken, a woman named Marta who handled cameras and generators, and a younger guy called Reese, who wouldn't go below the 3rd terrace anymore. I knew because I arrived early one evening and found them arguing beside the gate. "He's still here," Reese said, seeing me. "Tell him." Marta's expression shuddered the moment she realized I could hear. "Tell me what?" Reese looked to Ken, didn't get permission, and blurted it anyway. "People don't survive stack breaks on the south grade. They don't survive calling out below 5th. They don't survive if the wall answers." Marta snapped. "Shut up." "No," Reese said. "You shut up. Arthur said if another one got marked, we close the site." At that, Ken physically shoved him back. Marked. I felt absurdly angry. What the hell is that supposed to mean? No one answered. Marta busied herself checking the camera case, but her hands were shaking badly enough that she dropped a battery. Reese stared at me the way men look at roadkill that might still move. Finally, Ken said, "Do your shift. Stay out of the deep cut. We'll review tomorrow." Review what? But he had already decided silence was safer than truth. That night, I searched the admin trailer properly for the first time. Not desk drawers and shelf bins. I pulled file boxes from under cabinets, pried open a locked metal closet with a tire iron from the shed, and emptied old binders onto the floor. If Black Ridge was playing at folklore, it had been playing for decades. Maintenance logs vanished in clusters. Inspection forms had pages cut out with a blade. One thin spiral notebook labeled Night Events 1987 to 1989 contained almost nothing except dates, weather, and one phrase repeated so often it stopped feeling handwritten. Delay increasing. Near the bottom of the closet, I found a canvas dispatch bag, full of older documents. Most were damp-stained copies of geological surveys and accident forms. Tucked inside was a yellow maintenance journal with the company logo from the 60s and a typed insert paper clipped to the front. If subject survives 3rd infraction, contact A. Hale immediately. Do not allow subject into western tunnels unescorted. Subject, not worker, not guard. I was still reading when the trailer lights dimmed once and came back. Then, from somewhere under the floor, a voice I recognized as my own said very gently, "You should have left after Pennsylvania." I spun so fast I knocked the chair over. The trailer was empty. The floor beneath my boots gave 3 answering taps, like knuckles testing wood from the other side. For the first time since taking the job, I understood that my survival was not proof I'd found the safe path. It was proof I was on the path intended for me. The oldest records at Black Ridge did not describe a quarry. They described a discovery and the bureaucratic panic that followed it. I spent 3 nights piecing that together from partial folders, invoice carbon copies, engineering memos, and photographs whose edges had fused with age. Whoever had cleaned the archive before me had been thorough where it mattered and careless where it didn't. They removed conclusions, names, recommendations. They left hints because hints looked harmless to people who already knew what not to see. The photographs were what unsettled me first. In the earliest shots from 1964, the men posing at the excavation line wore white hard hats and cigarette smiles. Behind them should have been newly cut granite. Instead, there were walls unlike anything exposed anywhere else on the site. Smooth plains the color of winter glass, crossed by parallel grooves so large they made the workers look like insects beside machine marks from a god-sized drill. Only they weren't drill marks. They turned too cleanly at the corners. Some disappeared into the stone and re-emerged several yards away with no visible interruption, as if the wall possessed depth in directions we didn't. In one photograph, a worker had rested his hand against a groove. Written on the back in blue ink were the words, "Hollow response after contact, 11 SEC." Another set of photos showed the same wall months later buried again behind a rough blast face, as if the company had deliberately covered over its own find and resumed ordinary quarrying above it. The caption on one image read, "Lower vein sealed per federal instruction." Federal instruction from whom was not included. I found a heavily redacted report in a folder marked Substrate Anomalies. Every page that should have explained anything had been removed, but one paragraph remained, because whoever blacked it out had missed a carbon copy underneath. Excavation ceased after repeated incidents involving delayed geological responses. Observed phenomena included non-local vibration repetition, apparent anticipatory resonance, and progressive mimicry of human-generated acoustic signatures. Personnel reassignment recommended pending full containment strategy. There was no signature. I read it 3 times in the yellow light of the trailer and felt something ugly loosen in me. Not relief, recognition. That language, apparent anticipatory resonance, containment strategy, belonged to the same institutional dialect I had spent years speaking. The voice of official astonishment, slimming itself down into paperwork until what remained sounded manageable. 7 men had died in Pennsylvania because people like me translated negligence into weather. How many had vanished at Black Ridge because someone translated impossible into geology? The quarry helped answer that question. It started with the footprints. Rule 6 had seemed the most idiotic line on the sheet. If fresh footprints appear in solid stone, continue walking. At 2:07 on a moonless Thursday, I saw them on the east wall between terraces 4 and 5. Not muddy prints on rock. Not dust. They were depressions in the granite itself, as if a barefoot person had stepped, while the surface was soft, and only then allowed it to harden. There were 6 of them, ascending straight up a vertical face, human in shape, but too deep, each toe defined with tender precision. I stopped dead. The 7th print pushed outward from the wall while I watched. Not fast, not dramatically. The stone simply changed over the course of a breath, dimpling and opening into the next exact impression. No hand formed it. No body accompanied it. It was the trace of motion without the mover. I obeyed Rule 6 because nothing in me wanted to know what happened if I didn't. I kept walking, head forward, pulse hammering in my gums. Behind me, after a delay of maybe 15 seconds, came the sound of somebody continuing up the wall. I did not look back. The second thing I found was not in the archive but beneath it. The admin trailer sat on concrete piers over a shallow crawl space used for old cable runs. A rusted hatch in the floor was hidden under 2 file boxes and a warped doormat. I might never have noticed it if the voice beneath the trailer hadn't started humming while I sorted photographs. It was the excavator horn again, reduced to a vibration more than a tone. I knelt, moved the boxes, and saw the ring pull. Inside the crawl space were bundled conduits, dead insects, a snapped folding chair, and a narrow lockbox chained to one pier. The chain had already been cut years earlier. Inside the box was a cassette recorder, 3 tapes, and a memo envelope addressed in pencil to A. Hale only. I listened to the first tape in my motel room, because I did not trust the quarry with any more of its own secrets. The recording was dated May 14th, 1989. The speaker was a man with a smoker's rasp and a controlled, exhausted way of talking. Arthur Hale, though I didn't know it then. "They've revised the rules again," he said. "3rd revision this month. Doesn't matter. It isn't the rules changing. It's the imitation improving." A click. Paper movement. Subject on second watch cycle ignored false siren, looked into lower cut, and was not taken. Repeat. Not taken. Wall activity following him now. Crew instructed to avoid direct address. If he asks for names, do not give names. Recognition appears to accelerate assimilation. Assimilation. I rewound and listened again. The second tape was worse. A woman cried quietly through most of it while Arthur spoke over her in clipped bursts. They aren't dead when they enter. This needs to be stated plainly, because headquarters keeps using the word loss. There are no remains because the substrate opens. The accepted don't resist after the final approach. They behave as if meeting someone familiar. The woman in the background kept saying, "My brother heard them under the floor," over and over, until the tape snapped to silence. By then I knew I had two options: leave or find Arthur. The Quarry chose for me the following night. Around 1:30, I was standing near the west maintenance tunnels, staring at the black mouths cut into the stone. I had no intention of entering. Rule 8 was the only instruction on the page that named a person, and after the tapes, I wasn't interested in volunteering for whoever Arthur Hale had become. Then the radio at my chest clicked once. Not static, a deliberate, tiny acknowledgement. The speaker remained silent, but from inside the leftmost tunnel, very far back, a man's voice said, "You took longer than I hoped." I shined my flashlight toward the opening, before remembering the other rules. The beam barely penetrated 20 feet before the tunnel swallowed it. "I'm not going in there," I called. "You already came farther than you were supposed to." The voice wasn't old in the way I expected. It was tired, lived in, like a tool worn exactly to one hand. "Arthur?" A long pause. "Yes, I found your tapes. I assumed you would. You break sequence." There was no humor in it. "I want answers." "No," he said from the darkness. "You want absolution. Answers are just what men like you ask for when absolution doesn't come." That landed because it was true. I should have walked away. Instead, I stepped to the mouth of the tunnel, cold air breathing out over my face from depths the plans had never shown. "Then give me the useful version," I said. A figure detached itself from the dark 3 yards in. Thin coat, lantern in one hand, beard gone mostly white. Arthur Hale looked less like a guardian than a man who had been surviving inside a bad idea for too long to remember the distinction. He studied me with something close to pity. "It shouldn't have chosen you," he said. "That means it recognized something before I did." "Chose me for what?" Arthur lifted the lantern slightly. The light showed tool marks on the tunnel walls, then something beneath them, smoother planes, faint grooves, a geometry older than excavation and younger than thought. "To come home," he said. Arthur lived in the west tunnels, the way shipwrecked men must live inside wreckage. Not comfortably, not sanely, but with the expertise of someone who had outlasted every softer arrangement. He did not invite me deeper, so much as fail to stop me when I followed. The maintenance tunnel widened after 50 yards into an old pump chamber with a cot, a camp stove, shelves of canned food, battery lanterns, paper maps, and an entire wall covered in rule sheets pinned layer over layer. Different fonts, different decades, some typed, some handwritten, some stained brown with water or something darker. The earliest had only 4 rules. The latest, mine, had 14, if you counted the reverse. "Did you write them?" I asked. "Some of them. Most were inherited." Arthur set the lantern on an overturned crate and motioned for me to stay well clear of the chamber's rear wall. Unlike the rest of the tunnel, that section had been covered with bolted steel plates, sealed at the edges with poured concrete. "You expect me to believe that's holding something back?" "No," he said. "I expect you to understand it tells me where the pressure is." He poured coffee from a blackened kettle into 2 chipped mugs. I didn't want any. I took one anyway because refusing felt childish in a place like that. "Start with the truth," I said. "No folklore." Arthur gave me a look so flat it stung. "The truth is the folklore version," he said. "The official version is what turned this place into a recurring problem." He told it in pieces, pausing whenever the walls around us made a sound he didn't like. Black Ridge had opened on a small scale in the late 50s. In 1964, a controlled blast exposed the lower crystalline layer. Initial analysis called it a metamorphic anomaly. Then, the delay phenomena began. Impacts echoed back minutes later from the wrong direction. Drill vibrations repeated after machinery shut down. Men reported hearing blasting patterns in their sleep. The company brought in military contractors under a geological pretext. By then, it was too late to pretend the substrate was inert. "What was it?" I asked. Arthur rubbed at his jaw. "Depends which department was naming it that quarter. Resonant medium, cognitive mineral, non-biological adaptive matrix. That's not an answer. No, it's a pile of uniforms trying not to say we found something underground that learned faster than we did." He went on. Early accidents looked ordinary. Falls, equipment failures, one blast mistimed by a full 10 seconds after the crew had already advanced. Then the rules started emerging from pattern analysis. Do not repeat. Do not establish rhythm. Do not give clear signals after dark. Avoid introducing light into the deep cut at fixed intervals. Never answer your own voice. The rules weren't about safety, I said slowly. They were about limiting education, Arthur replied. And the ones who broke them? He stared into his coffee for so long I thought he might refuse. They weren't always taken. That was the first mistake. If the wall crushed a man, people understood fear. If a man walked away from a blast that should have torn him apart, they called it luck. If he began hearing things, talking to echoes, seeing shapes in the lower cut, well, quarry work and whiskey have hidden stranger stories. He met my eyes then. People who broke enough rules and survived were never the lucky ones. They were the accepted ones. I didn't want to ask the next question. I asked it anyway. What does accepted mean? Arthur's voice went almost gentle. It means the quarry stops treating you like impact and starts treating you like template. I thought of the rock slide splitting around me, the faceless man below the 5th terrace. My name returned in my own voice from the cut. No bodies were found, I said, because there were no bodies left to find. Arthur stood and went to one of the shelves. From a cigar box, he removed a Polaroid and handed it to me. It showed a man in coveralls standing with both palms on a quarry wall. Mid-30s, dark hair, calm posture. There was no fear in him at all, only recognition. Beneath the picture, in pen, Thomas Vale, 3 days before entry. He walked into it? I said. Arthur nodded. The stone opened, smooth as a door in water, closed behind him. No blood, no sound but a pressure change in the tunnel microphones. How many? Arthur laughed once, bitter and breathless. Count official reports, or actual. Official says 9 missing across 30 years. Actual depends what you consider missing. Some came back in pieces that still answered to their names when the floor vibrated right. I nearly set the mug down too hard. Pieces. His face changed then, not into cruelty, into the expression people wear when deciding whether another person can survive an image. Not flesh, he said. Impressions. Echoes in stone. Behaviors without the bodies that taught them. I thought of the footprints forming in the wall. Arthur saw understanding land and did not soften it. The quarry doesn't eat, he said. It records. And when enough of a person accumulates, voice, gait, habits, fear, guilt, it can replay them well enough to continue the conversation. Something in the rear wall ticked sharply. Arthur turned at once and listened. After a moment, satisfied, he faced me again. You should quit, he said. Tonight. No dawn handoff. No courtesy. Walk to your truck and do not stop before the interstate. If it's that simple, why are you still here? I expected evasion. What I got was worse, because I helped make the rules survivable. I said nothing. Arthur's eyes had the distant steadiness of a man rehearsing blame he had long ago accepted no one could adequately assign. In '89, they wanted to reopen lower extraction for a quarter. Granite prices were up. I was on nights then. Corporate wanted a local solution, not another federal paper trail. So I did what practical men always do around an impossible problem. I made procedures. I tracked patterns. I found tolerances. Which horn notes returned quickest? Which lights provoked mimicry? Which men needed removing after infractions? You kept it functioning. I kept it fed slowly enough to call it management. That was the first honest, monstrous thing anyone had said to me at Black Ridge, and it rang because I recognized the species. There are careers built on converting catastrophe into acceptable loss. I had belonged to that species myself. Arthur saw it in my face. That look, he said, that's why it chose you. I stood so fast the coffee sloshed over my hand. Don't. You think I'm insulting you. I think you don't know a damn thing about me. Arthur's silence gave me away. He already did. I felt my mouth go dry. How? The Quarry likes rehearsing confessions, not words. Pressure. Sequence. It gave me enough to know you signed off on 7 dead miners somewhere else and spent years pretending you'd only altered paper. The chamber seemed to tilt slightly around me. It told you that? Arthur shook his head. It let me feel how you remember it. That should have sounded impossible. Instead, it felt specific enough to be true. Then you know I'm leaving, I said. Arthur looked tired again. You can try, but once it has your regret in clear pattern, distance stops meaning what you want it to. I made it 3 steps toward the tunnel before he said the thing that brought me back. It's not trying to kill you, Eli. That's the problem. It thinks you belong to it already. I did leave the tunnel that night. I walked out into freezing air and stood under the West Rim stars with my hands shaking so hard, I dropped the flashlight twice. I got all the way to my truck before I realized I was still inside the gate, keys in hand, engine ready, and I could not picture the road home. Not metaphorically, not emotionally. The route itself had gone soft in my mind, as if the quarry had used up all the firm edges. I sat there until dawn, not sleeping, not driving, listening to delayed sounds move through the cut, like thoughts arriving in the wrong skull. Arthur found me in the morning leaning against the driver's door with my coat buttoned wrong. He set a paper sack of food on the hood and said, "If you were going to run, you would have by now. Maybe I'm just tired. Maybe." He looked toward the quarry. "Or maybe it's already using familiar guilt to anchor you." He spoke as though discussing weather, and because I no longer had energy for outrage, I let him. Over the next 2 nights I did something I had not done honestly in years. I listened to a man explain the shape of a disaster, without interrupting to make it manageable. Arthur showed me old diagrams from federal survey teams. Their instruments had mapped the lower crystalline layer as a vein at first, then a basin, then something with branching structures radiating through bedrock far beyond the original cut. Conventional terms failed quickly, because the material behaved like neither ore nor organism. Core samples changed resonance after exposure to recorded speech. Broken fragments reproduced impact sequences with increasing fidelity. One sealed sample block had begun answering lab taps from the wrong side. "It learns vibration," Arthur said, tracing branching lines on a stained geological sheet. "Not just sound, pressure, rhythm, repetition. Machinery taught it force. Boots taught it weight. Voices taught it intervals. Blasting taught it anticipation. Once it maps a pattern clearly enough, it doesn't just repeat it, it adjusts toward the result. Meaning, if it hears 5 men walk the same route every night, eventually, it can produce the pressure signature of 6. I stared at the branching diagram, and the rules break the patterns. He nodded. Interrupt them before they become legible. No predictable lights, no repeated horn signals, no pausing at sirens, no direct engagement with imitations. Confusion is the only thing that slows recognition. The statement hung there between us until I heard its other meaning. The rules aren't protecting workers. Arthur's mouth tightened. Not primarily. They're protecting the quarry, keeping it drowsy, he said, keeping it from acquiring a stable model. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. So the whole site was built around not teaching the rock too much about us. After we had already taught it mining, hierarchy, emergency signaling, and how fear sounds in a tunnel full of trapped men. Yes, I turned away, because some reactions need space to become visible. The old fury I carried from Pennsylvania had always had a human target. Lawyers, operators, executives, myself. Black Ridge rearranged that. Here the crime was older and stranger. Exposure itself. Men had cut open the earth, found something studying back, and answered with procedures. Of course they had. That was what industries did when they found living complexity in places budgeted as resource. Arthur let me think. Then he said, almost lightly, "You introduced yourself the first evening." I already knew what he meant. Hearing it aloud still made my stomach tighten. The horn. The horn. Arthur folded the map. A machine signal after sunset, isolated from crew noise, carried clean into the deep cut. One note. Full force. You couldn't have offered better. I didn't know. No, he said. That may be why it took so strongly. I looked at him sharply. What does that mean? He hesitated for the first time since I'd met him. It prefers contradictions. That's not an explanation. It's the best one I've got. He rubbed a hand over his beard. Most men who became accepted were simple in the relevant ways. Habitual. Predictable. Frightened in straight lines. You came here already split. Guilty enough to seek punishment. Proud enough to deny seeking it. Trained to lie on paper while craving truth in person. Then you sounded a clear introduction into the cut, as if you wanted something to answer. Contradictions make richer templates. I thought of the faceless worker, the radio calling me by name, the stone allowing rocks to part around me. Protected, I said. That's what it's doing, isn't it? Arthur did not lie. Yes. The word landed uglier than if he'd said hunted. He led me farther into the west tunnels on the third night, against his own advice. You need context, he said, which I understood later meant he needed me to see something before I chose how to end this. Beyond the pump chamber, the maintenance works gave way to older cuts, and finally to passages that had not been made by men in any normal sense. The walls lost their chisel marks. Their surfaces became smooth and faintly striated, the grooves enormous and deliberate, bending through stone at angles that made depth hard to trust. My flashlight beam seemed to skim across planes that were not always there when I blinked. Don't touch, Arthur said. I wasn't going to. Everyone says that until it hums. We reached a chamber no map had shown, round as a cistern and high enough that the lantern light couldn't find the ceiling. The center held a sealed bore casing surrounded by old instrument frames and cables cut long ago. Around the chamber wall, at shoulder height, were dozens of shallow impressions. Handprints, I thought first. Then I saw they were too various. Palms, boot soles, foreheads. One perfect side profile pressed into the stone, as if someone had lain down inside it. This is where they brought samples up, Arthur said. Early on, before the lower cut expanded. It expanded. You think quarry blasts made those deep sections? Some of them, yes, not all. I turned slowly, the chamber breathing cold around us. You're telling me it excavated itself. I'm telling you it learned that humans reveal what they value by cutting toward it. Something thrummed once underfoot, not loud, not threatening, recognizing. My knees almost buckled. Arthur caught my arm. It knows you're here. Can it hear thoughts too? No, only the body they make. He let go, but that's often enough. Then it happened. Not a voice exactly. More like a pattern of pressure through the floor, the wall, my teeth, my scarred left wrist where the old mine debris had clipped me years earlier. A sequence not heard but understood. You came back. I knew the sentence before words attached to it. I looked at Arthur, horrified. Did you feel that? He stared at me with the desolate anger of a man being proven right. Not clearly. Why me? He said nothing. The chamber answered in a softer thrum, that moved through the handprints on the wall like wind through reeds. Because you kept the others buried. My mouth filled with metal. I was back at the Pennsylvania conference table, the envelope near my plate, the lawyer explaining how certain wording preserves stability. Buried. That was the word he had used for the case, not the men. Arthur saw whatever crossed my face and took one step back. I didn't tell it that, he said. I know. We left the chamber in silence. At the mouth of the tunnel, dawn had begun whitening the east rim. The quarry below looked normal enough to fool aerial photographs, investor packets, and any man committed to practical lies. Arthur spoke without looking at me. When it starts framing you with your own guilt, time shortens. For me? For everyone. I turned toward the cut. For the first time since arriving, I understood that the thing beneath Black Ridge did not want my body. It wanted my pattern stable enough to continue, and I was already giving it too much to work with. After the chamber, the quarry stopped pretending subtlety. It no longer merely echoed my movements, it anticipated them. On Monday night, I reached for the gate chain and heard its delayed rattle from below before my hand touched metal. On Tuesday, I paused at the north camera mast to light a cigarette I had already decided not to smoke, and a voice from the east wall said, "Don't bother," half a second before I put the lighter away. By Wednesday, the speaker in my radio had begun clicking to the rhythm of thoughts I had not voiced, as if intention itself carried a measurable pressure through muscle and bone. Arthur called it predictive convergence. I called it the end of privacy. The crew stopped coming altogether after Reese quit. Marta left a box of batteries and fresh log sheets at the gate one afternoon, waved once without getting out of her truck, and drove off. Ken lasted 2 more days. Then he met me in the admin trailer at dusk, placed the site keys on the desk and said, "I've got a daughter in Barre." I should have remembered that sooner. "Ken," he held up a hand, "don't ask me to stay. If Arthur hasn't fixed it yet, he can't." Fixed what? He looked around the trailer as if the walls themselves had been listening long enough to deserve clarity. "You don't walk like the same man when you come off shift," he said. "And the cameras keep catching someone at your shoulder where nobody should be." Then he left me alone with the site. That same night, I reviewed the footage Marta had been too frightened to mention aloud. Most cameras showed ordinary darkness, snow fence, equipment sheds, empty roads. But on Terrace 4, whenever I entered frame, there was a second distortion tracking beside me. Not a shadow, not a person, more like a vertical gloss in the air, a human-shaped thinning of distance. Sometimes it lagged a step behind, sometimes it moved a fraction ahead, forcing me to watch myself being pre-echoed. At 1:12 a.m. on the West Rim camera, the distortion separated from me completely and walked into the quarry wall. I watched that segment 12 times. On the 13th, I noticed the wall around the distortion had already been shaped to receive it. The silhouettes came next. Granite faces all around the deep cut began developing shallow human outlines, not sculpted but emerging, shoulder curves and skull domes, and the suggestion of folded arms just beneath the surface, as if entire crowds were standing in fogged glass, waiting for somebody outside to recognize them. Most were generic, a few weren't. One had my posture. One had the profile from an old photograph of myself I'd once seen in a company directory. Head tilted slightly forward, jaw set, the expression of a man hearing bad news and already calculating what version he could survive. I threw a rock at that wall. The stone struck with a note too resonant to be granite and bounced away. Immediately, the ground beneath me produced 7 soft knocks. Not accusation, reminder. That was when the dreams started arriving before sleep. I would sit in the trailer writing meaningless entries. Wind from northwest, camera 2 flickered, no trespass, and suddenly know, with total sensory certainty, the smell of the Pennsylvania mine after the blast. Wet insulation, scorched oil, iron. I would feel the pressure of settled dust in my sinuses, and hear a trapped man calling from behind collapsed timbers in a rhythm too weak to be hope and too stubborn to be dying. Then I would blink and find myself still in Vermont with the pen gouging through paper. The quarry was not showing me memories. It was learning how regret arranged my body. Arthur confirmed that on the 6th night after the chamber. "It's moved past voice," he said. "You said it yourself. It's not learning language." We were standing near the sealed bore casing underground, listening to the wall emit tiny thermal ticks that sounded almost conversational. "It's learning effective structure," he went on. "Fear, guilt, anticipation, grief. The stuff that gives pattern motive. You say that like motive is just another vibration. For us, maybe it is." I should have hated him for speaking calmly. Instead, I envied it. "What does it want from me?" Arthur's answer came too quickly. He had been holding it. "To know what remorse does next." I laughed at that, high and ugly. "You're kidding." "No." Then it picked the wrong man. I've had 15 years to prove remorse doesn't do anything. Arthur looked at the wall, not me. That may be why it's interested. We heard the sentence together this time, not in words, in a slow, whole-body pressure that traveled from the bore casing into the soles of our feet and upward, shaping meaning, the way thunder shapes weather. "You taught us what regret feels like." Arthur actually flinched. I could not breathe for a second. Not because the message was loud, because it was intimate. The quarry had taken the most private chamber in me, the sealed one, where I kept the 7 men from Pennsylvania, behind legal language, and insomnia, and alcohol, and years of practiced deflection, and reproduced its pressure cleanly enough that another human being felt it. Arthur steadied himself against the casing. "It's integrating you." "What does that mean?" "It means it can compare every imprint already here against yours." "What imprints?" He swept one hand toward the walls, the tunnels, the quarry over our heads. "Everyone. Decades of them. Fear from cave-ins. Greed from men who pushed blasts too close to quota. Loneliness from nights like this. Supervisors lying upward, workers lying downward, engineers pretending not to notice impossible readings. It doesn't remember in scenes. It remembers in loads." The word hit with grotesque accuracy. Loads, burden, weight carried through structure. The quarry wasn't haunted. It was remembering by pressure. That idea should have emptied the place of ghosts. Instead, it made every inch more crowded. I spent the rest of that shift on the quarry floor for the first time since Rule 1. I don't know whether I went there out of fatalism or curiosity. Perhaps there was no difference by then. The abandoned excavator stood exactly where it had stood on my first night. Cab windows dust-blind, arm folded. Around it the ground was scattered with old drill stems and fresh stone fragments. The deepest cut loomed ahead like a section through a thought too large to own. I felt no hostility there. That was the worst part. The quarry floor had the strained tenderness of a room prepared for a returning relative no one entirely trusted. My radio clicked. Then, with perfect clarity and no speaker distortion at all, my own voice said from behind me, "Eli." I turned. A man stood by the excavator. For one impossible instant I believed I was seeing myself. Same coat, same build, same careful slouch through the shoulders. Then the moon moved. His face was almost right, but not complete. The eyes had no wetness. The skin carried faint groove lines at the temples where flesh should have turned smoothly. He looked not dead, not alive, but rendered from memory by something that understood burden better than anatomy. "What are you?" I asked. He smiled with visible effort, as if the movement had been assembled from observation. "Still learning," he said in my voice. I backed away. He did not follow. He only watched me with a grief that felt sincerely borrowed. Behind him, the quarry wall developed a fresh silhouette from the inside out. Mine. The state announced the demolition 3 days later. I learned about it from a faxed notice slid under the admin trailer door like a joke from the 20th century. Emergency geological closure authorization. Black Ridge Quarry, to be permanently collapsed by controlled sequence under joint state and federal oversight. Restricted personnel to clear site by 0600 Friday. Charges to be placed along lower instability points and deep wall fractures. They still thought burial was a solution. Arthur didn't need to read the notice twice. If they fracture the lower layer cleanly enough, he said, they'll give it roads. Through bedrock? Through every crack the blast opens. He spread old survey maps across the pump chamber crate and traced fault lines reaching west toward groundwater, east toward logging land, south toward a reservoir feeder system. The branching structure I'd seen before now looked less theoretical, more like roots awaiting rain. We can't stop the demolition team, I said. No, Arthur replied, but we can stop it from understanding what they're doing. The plan, if that word deserves to cover two frightened men improvising against a thinking quarry and a government timetable, came from the oldest rule sheet Arthur possessed. Its first line, later crossed out, read, "When mimicry stabilizes, disruption must exceed interpretation." Overload it, I said. Confuse it beyond pattern extraction. That's your technical phrasing? It's the only phrasing that matters. We had one night before the charge crews arrived to pre-rig the walls. One night to break every rule with enough disorder that the substrate could not reduce the input into humanly useful form. Not silence, noise, not restraint, contradiction. I laughed when the plan settled, because it felt too much like my life. Cause a disaster large enough to bury the original disaster underneath it. Arthur heard the laugh and said quietly, "This time you're trying to keep something buried." The difference mattered. I held on to it. We started at dusk. I drove the generator cart from shed to shed, while Arthur reactivated flood circuits that hadn't been used in years. We opened every equipment bay. We dragged radios, compressors, warning klaxons, old seismic monitors, and backup batteries onto the upper terraces. We set random timers where we could, and manual switches where we couldn't. Arthur had me chalk sequences on plywood boards because we won't trust our timing once it starts answering. By full dark, the quarry looked like a stage waiting for a disaster play. "Once we begin," Arthur said, "do not react to anything that sounds familiar. Not my voice, not yours, not them." Them? He glanced toward the deep cut. Everybody it can borrow. We split positions. Arthur took the west tunnel controls to monitor subsurface pressure. I stayed on the central road above the quarry floor, with access to the flood grid and machine yard. At 11:57 p.m., we started. I hit the first bank of floodlights. White fire poured down the terraces, striking walls, roads, machinery, and the deepest cut all at once. The quarry answered instantly, not with sound, but with the visible shiver of grooves emerging beneath the rock skin, as if enormous geometric muscles had flexed awake. I sounded the first horn, then another, then the loader alarm, the backup beeper from a dead haul truck, a siren salvaged from the blasting shed, and 3 radios on separate channels all transmitting different chatter snippets Arthur had recorded over the years. Some were weather calls, some were inventory numbers. One was a woman reciting grocery items. Another was me, from an hour earlier, reading the names of the 7 Pennsylvania dead aloud for the first time since I'd helped bury them in paper. The quarry tried to answer everything. Its first returns were fast and clean. Echo horns, delayed sirens, my voice from the east wall, Arthur's from below the 5th terrace telling me to stop. I ignored them and changed sequence. Floodlights off north, on south, 2 horns together, 10 seconds of silence. Generator surge, radio static. Floodlights into the deepest cut after midnight, sweeping wildly, never holding steady. The ground began to buck, not earthquake motion, pattern stress. Tremors running in intersecting lines beneath the roads as if something below kept committing to one interpretation and having it ruined before completion. Arthur's voice came over the radio, real enough this time to trust, only because it was nearly drowned in feedback. It's losing lock. Keep changing. So I broke every remaining rule I could remember. I counted all 7 terraces aloud, then did it backward. I called into the deepest cut and answered my own call from a second radio. I walked toward fresh footprints appearing in the roadway and stepped through them before they finished forming. I entered zones Arthur had forbidden and lit them up with portable lamps, then killed them and sounded horns from the dark. The Quarry retaliated, not with violence, but with imitation. Men appeared where there were no men. Dozens at first, then hundreds in flashes along the walls and roads. Workers in old hard hats, supervisors in fluorescent vests. One of them was Ken. One was Reese, with his jaw caved in by something I knew had not happened to him. Several were versions of myself, at different ages, each carrying a different arrangement of exhaustion. They did not rush me. They watched, waiting for me to choose one signal and make it meaningful. I refused. Arthur emerged from the west tunnel shouting for me to get to the upper road. Behind him, the tunnel mouth had begun shedding dust in smooth streams, not collapsing but opening wider from internal pressure. "The lower wall's translating," he yelled. We ran for the central switch bank together. Halfway there, the Quarry spoke through everything at once. Metal railings, truck panels, my kneecaps, the fillings in Arthur's molars. The pressure resolved into a terrible plea. "Stay. Let the pattern finish." Arthur stumbled, one hand flying to his chest. I dragged him upright. "No," I said, though I don't know whether I was answering it or the part of myself that wanted surrender disguised as belonging. At the switch bank, Arthur shoved a detonator key into my palm. "What is this?" "Old seismic charges. Non-grid, random depth. You said blasting teaches it. Ordered blasting does. This won't." He coughed hard, spat blood-black grit, and gripped my sleeve. "When I seal the tunnel, don't come after me." I stared at him. "No, there's no time." The west wall split then, not open but articulate. Human silhouettes pushed outward by the dozens, shoulders and heads and reaching arms, defined in luminous pale grooves. From the center of them all, my own unfinished likeness leaned halfway through the stone and smiled with aching recognition. Arthur saw it and chose both of us. He shoved me toward the upper road and turned downhill. Arthur, he was already running for the tunnel mouth, lantern swinging. "Sound everything," so I did. I jammed the detonator key and triggered the random charges. Not a clean sequence. Chaos. Deep thumps from wrong places, overlapping with horns, sirens, radio chatter, floodlights strobing between terraces. The Quarry convulsed. Entire sections of the lower cut sheared inward at bad angles, burying walls before their patterns could settle. The excavator tipped, disappeared in a plume of granite dust, then surfaced again halfway upright, before the next collapse took it fully. Arthur reached the tunnel entrance and slammed the manual gate lever. Steel dropped. For 1 second I saw him framed in lantern light behind the bars, small and steady and unbearably tired. Then the west face came down. I don't remember the run to the rim clearly. Noise erased itself while I was still making it. Dust turned the floodlights into blank suns. The roads buckled under my boots, then steadied, then vanished behind me in slabs. Somewhere below, through all of it, the Quarry produced one last coherent message in the pressure of the collapsing ground. Not anger, not hunger, confusion. As dawn bled into the eastern trees, Black Ridge Quarry stopped being a geometry of cuts and became a single enormous crater filled with broken granite and the silence that follows a sentence, interrupted forever. Or so I thought. I gave my statement to 3 agencies over 6 months and watched all of them translate Black Ridge into survivable paperwork. Slope failure, legacy blasting voids, unauthorized site activity, loss of historical records, presumed dead, Arthur Hale. My own role became a blur of contradictory testimony, and trauma-associated perceptual distortion. That phrase appeared twice in the final summary I was permitted to read. No charges were brought against me. No commendations either. The land changed hands through shell companies and state liens and, eventually, a renewable energy consortium looking for domestic stone aggregate and subsurface stability for a storage project. I moved twice, quit drinking once, failed at it, and began again. The Pennsylvania dead did not leave me, but they no longer waited in the same locked room. Black Ridge had done something to the architecture of guilt. It had made the burden communal, geological, less forgivable maybe, also less private. For years I heard nothing. Then, almost 6 years after the collapse, a padded envelope arrived at my apartment in Albany with no return address. Inside was a thumb drive and a single note in block capitals I recognized from Arthur's rule sheets. If it starts again, someone should know what answered first. The drive contained land transfer maps, drilling permits, and a set of internal incident files from Green Mountain Renewables, dated only 3 weeks earlier. I do not know who sent them. Maybe Marta, maybe some clerk with the old instincts Arthur and I shared, maybe no living person at all. By then I had stopped drawing hard borders around the possible. The files concerned preliminary core sampling at the former Black Ridge collapse zone. Surveyor, Leah Hennessy, age 26. Weather, clear. Drill depth target 600 feet. At first the reports were banal. Equipment calibration, bit wear, subsurface density readings unusually high for reclaimed fracture debris. Then the language shifted. At 403 feet, drill resistance increased without corresponding density spike. At 404 feet, upward vibration detected along shaft. At 405 feet, operator reported feedback pattern resembling counter-rotation. I watched the attached video 3 times before I trusted my stomach enough to continue. The rig stood on what had once been the eastern rim, now graded into a broad plateau over the buried crater. Leah Hennessy wore a white hard hat, safety glasses, and the distracted confidence of a person doing competent work in a world she still believed was inert. Men around her checked monitors, adjusted pressure, joked about old quarry legends picked up from local subcontractors. Then the drill slowed, not jammed, matched. The vibration monitor began printing evenly spaced spikes. 3 close together. Pause. 3 more. Leah frowned at the screen. What is that? Percussion off the stabilizer. One of the techs said, maybe casing chatter. She increased pressure. The spikes returned in exact synchrony with the new input. The men around the console lost their smiles almost in sequence, each one waiting for the others to validate what he was already seeing. That detail hurt me most. I knew that choreography. Denial likes witnesses. Leah tapped the readout with one gloved finger. Can something below mirror the drill string? She asked. No one answered her. On the next line, the monitor software flagged, no seismic activity detected. Source of vibration, unknown. Then the camera jolted as everybody on site heard it through the rig mast. Knock, knock, knock. Pause. Knock, knock, knock. Not loud. Not underground enough to feel safe. Not mechanical in any dead, innocent way. Leah actually smiled then, uncertain, charmed against her better judgment. Somebody's messing with the sensor, she said. She leaned closer to the bore console. The microphone near her collar caught the next words clearly. Hello? I shut the video off there the first time. When I made myself finish it, the file ended less than 40 seconds later with static, men shouting over each other, a pressure alarm no one identified, and the drill torque climbing, as if something beneath the bit had not merely answered the pattern, but taken hold of it. No fatalities were listed in the file set. No conclusion either. Only a temporary work stoppage pending equipment review, and a note that local rumors were interfering with contractor retention. I sat at my kitchen table until dawn, with Arthur's note beside the laptop. and the old feeling back in my teeth. The sense that a sound made years ago had traveled down farther than any human intention, and was still returning, refined. I wanted to believe burial had worked. I wanted to believe chaos had broken the pattern permanently, that Arthur's death had meant the end of something instead of merely an interruption. But the truth at Black Ridge had never favored endings. It favored continuations, disguised as solved problems. I thought about the first horn, the ridiculous casual note I'd sounded because silence made me uncomfortable, how long it had taken to come back, how different it had been on its return, as though the quarry had used the delay not to carry the sound, but to understand why a man would make it. That was what the drill had done, I realized, not woken it. Reintroduced us. If you are reading this because someone found these pages after the next report is filed and softened and buried, then this is the only rule I trust enough to leave behind. Do not mistake recognition for welcome. Whatever lies under Black Ridge is not ancient in the way legends like their monsters to be. It is recent, adaptive, unfinished. We taught it work before we taught it mercy. We taught it sequence before we taught it limits. And once, through me, through the first horn, through all the pressure of unconfessed human damage we carried into that cut, we taught it the shape of remorse. I used to think remorse was sterile, a private corrosion, something that hollowed a man but left the world untouched. I know better now. Under enough weight, remorse becomes pattern. Pattern becomes invitation. And somewhere beneath Vermont, below a collapsed quarry no map marks as unusual anymore, something is still listening for the next clear introduction, patient as bedrock, arranging our oldest mistakes into a language it can finally speak back to us. When it does, I don't think it will sound like a monster. I think it will sound like us.